In the remote hills of Montana, where morning mist clings to weathered fence posts and silence stretches for miles, a man named Weston Clay tends his modest ranch with the careful hands of someone who has known both great loss and quiet purpose. His neighbors see a solitary cowboy living simply, fixing what's broken, caring for his small herd with the patience that comes from years of understanding that some things cannot be rushed. What they don't see are the encrypted phones hidden in his barn, the quarterly reports from environmental boards across 3 continents, or the anonymous wire transfers that have saved dozens of failing family farms. Weston Clay is the invisible architect of a philanthropic empire worth hundreds of millions, a ghost who moves through the world of high finance and conservation while his boots remain firmly planted in Montana soil. But secrets, like morning mist, have a way of lifting when the light finds them. What happens when the woman hired to clean his humble ranch discovers the hidden truth that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Lena reached across the narrow bed in her studio apartment above Murphy's General Store, her fingers finding the familiar button by muscle memory alone. In the dim light filtering through threadbare curtains, she could make out the faded photograph on her nightstand. Her grandmother, Eleanor, standing proudly beside a small farmhouse that had been lost to bank foreclosure 15 years ago. "Another day, Grandma," she whispered to the image, a daily ritual that somehow made the weight of responsibility feel more manageable. The wooden floors creaked under her feet as she moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee from yesterday's grounds, reheated in the microwave. A quick shower in the cramped bathroom, where the hot water lasted exactly 4 minutes. Clean uniform pressed and ready, the burgundy vest and crisp white shirt that marked her as staff at Pine Ridge Lodge, where wealthy guests paid more for a weekend than she earned in 2 months. By 5:15, she was walking the 3 miles to work, her breath forming small clouds in the mountain air. The highway stretched empty before her, flanked by towering pines and the occasional ranch gate. This was the Montana most people never saw, not the postcard version with majestic peaks and pristine lakes, but the working landscape where families, like hers, had struggled for generations to make ends meet. The lodge appeared around the final bend, its log and stone architecture designed to look rustic while offering every modern luxury. Lena had memorized every detail of the building during her years of service. The hand-carved railings that cost more than her annual salary, the imported Italian marble in the lobby, the wine cellar stocked with bottles worth more than her monthly rent. She understood wealth not because she possessed it, but because she cleaned up after it. "Morning, Lena," called Maria Santos from the kitchen entrance. Maria had worked at the lodge for 12 years, starting as a dishwasher and working her way up to sous chef. She was one of the few people who knew about Lena's situation, the grandmother whose medical bills consumed most of her paycheck, the younger brother whose college dreams seemed to grow more distant each semester. "How's Elena doing?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the genuine concern of someone who understood the weight of family obligations. "Same," Lena replied, which was both truth and evasion. The same meant another sleepless night, listening to her grandmother's labored breathing, another conversation about treatment options they couldn't afford, another day of pretending that everything would somehow work out. The morning passed in its familiar rhythm. Lena cleaned the guest rooms with the attention to detail that had earned her recognition from management and the trust of returning visitors. She took pride in her work, understanding that these small acts of service mattered, even if they went largely unnoticed. Each perfectly folded towel, each spotless mirror, each carefully arranged pillow represented her commitment to excellence, regardless of circumstance. It was during her lunch break that she first heard about the flood. Terrible thing, said Harold Pitt, the lodge's longtime maintenance manager, as he sat across from her in the staff dining room. That storm last night took out the Miller place completely. Sarah's been cleaning houses in this valley for 20 years, and now she's got nothing but mud and debris. Lena had known Sarah Miller since childhood. Sarah's mother had worked alongside Lena's grandmother at the old canning factory before it closed. The interconnected web of working families in the valley meant that everyone's struggles rippled outward, affecting neighbors and friends in ways that outsiders rarely understood. "Is there anything we can do?" Lena asked. Harold shook his head. "She's staying with her sister in Billings for now. But here's the thing. She was supposed to clean the Clay place tomorrow. Old Weston Clay, the rancher up on Copper Creek Road. He specifically requested Sarah, and now he needs someone else," Lena finished. "Exactly. It's just a one-time thing, house cleaning after some work he had done, but he's particular about who he lets on his property. Sarah vouched for you, said you were the most trustworthy cleaner she knew." Lena felt a flicker of something, not quite hope, but possibility. Extra work meant extra money, which meant maybe catching up on her grandmother's medication costs, or perhaps setting aside something for her brother's textbooks. "What do you know about him?" she asked. Harold chuckled. "Weston Clay? He's been up there must be going on 15 years now. Keeps to himself mostly, quiet type. Lost his wife in some kind of accident back east before he came here. Bought that old ranch and fixed it up nice, but he doesn't socialize much. Polite enough when you see him in town, but he keeps his business to himself." That evening, Lena walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind turning over the opportunity. The extra work would help, certainly, but there was something else, a curiosity about the man who lived alone on the remote ranch, who requested the same cleaner year after year, who had somehow earned Sarah Miller's complete trust. Back in her apartment, she found her brother Danny waiting at the small kitchen table, his textbook spread across the surface like a reproach. At 19, he had their father's stubborn jaw and their mother's gentle eyes, along with a mind sharp enough to earn him a full scholarship to Montana State if only they could cover the living expenses. "How was work?" he asked, not looking. Up from his calculus homework. "Fine. Good, actually. I might have some extra cleaning work this weekend." Now he did look up, and she saw the familiar conflict in his expression, gratitude mixed with guilt, hope tempered by the knowledge that her extra work meant longer hours, more exhaustion, more sacrifice. "Lena, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "We all do what we have to do." Later that night, after Danny had returned to his dorm room and the apartment fell silent, Lena sat beside her grandmother's bed. At 78, Elena Maris retained the dignified bearing that had carried her through decades of hardship, but her breathing was more labored now, her hands more frail against the worn quilt. "Tell me about tomorrow," her grandmother said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena described the cleaning job, the remote ranch, the man who lived alone among the mountains. As she spoke, she noticed her grandmother's expression change, a flicker of something that might have been recognition. "Clay," Eleanor murmured. "Weston Clay. You know him?" "Not him, exactly. But I knew a Clay family, years ago. Before you were born. They owned a lot of land around here, back when the old mining operations were still running. Good people, quiet philanthropy, your grandfather used to say. They helped folks without making a show of it." Lena filed this information away, another piece of the puzzle that was beginning to form around the solitary rancher. As her grandmother drifted off to sleep, she found herself wondering what kind of man chose isolation over community. What kind of loss could drive someone to seek such complete solitude? The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the sharp brightness that only comes after a storm has washed the air clean. Lena borrowed Harold's old pickup truck for the drive to Copper Creek Road, following Sarah Miller's detailed directions through increasingly remote terrain. The ranch appeared gradually, first as a distant cluster of buildings nestled in a natural bowl between two pine-covered ridges, then with more detail as the gravel road wound down toward the valley floor. It was more substantial than she had expected. A main house of weathered logs and stone, several outbuildings including a large barn, corrals that spoke of serious livestock operation, and everywhere the signs of careful maintenance and pride in ownership. A man emerged from the barn as she parked near the house. Tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors, he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man comfortable in his own space. His hair was silver-streaked, his clothing practical and well-worn, his eyes the color of winter sky. "You must be Lena," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone unaccustomed to casual conversation. "I'm Weston Clay. Sarah spoke highly of you." "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Clay," she replied, noting the genuine warmth in his handshake despite his reserved manner. "Just Weston," he said. "And I should be thanking you. Taking on extra work to help out a neighbor. That says something about character." As he led her toward the house, Lena found herself studying the man who had somehow earned such loyalty from Sarah Miller, such mysterious recognition from her grandmother. There was something about him that didn't quite fit, a quality she couldn't name but could sense, like a current running beneath still water. The house itself was modest but beautifully maintained, with wide windows that captured the mountain views and comfortable furniture that spoke of a man who valued quality over ostentation. Everything was clean but lived in, organized but not obsessive. The work crew finished the kitchen renovation yesterday, Weston explained as he showed her around. "Good men, but they left quite a mess. I'd tackle it myself, but I've got a sick horse that needs attention." "Of course," Lena said, already assessing the scope of the work. "I'll have everything spotless." As Weston headed back toward the barn, she began her work with the systematic approach that had made her reputation. But as she cleaned, she found herself noticing details that seemed somehow significant. The complete absence of personal photographs, the high-end security system that seemed excessive for a rural ranch, the subtle quality of furnishings that suggested wealth carefully understated. It was while cleaning the kitchen that she first noticed the anomaly. Behind the refrigerator, partially hidden by the appliance's bulk, she glimpsed what appeared to be a second electrical panel. Not unusual in itself, but something about its placement, its newness compared to the rest of the house's fixtures, caught her attention. As the day wore on, she found herself drawn back to that detail, wondering why a simple rancher would need such elaborate electrical infrastructure, why the security system included features she'd only seen at the lodge, why everything about this modest ranch suggested careful layers of complexity beneath its simple surface. When Weston returned to check on her progress, she was struck again by the contradiction he represented. A man who lived simply but moved, with quiet authority, who seemed genuinely humble yet commanded immediate respect, who had chosen solitude but clearly possessed the social skills of someone comfortable in any setting. "You've done excellent work," he said, surveying the spotless kitchen. "Sarah was right about you." "Thank you," Lena replied, then found herself adding, "You have a beautiful place here." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or appreciation for the genuine compliment. "It suits me," he said simply. "Sometimes a man needs space to think." As she packed her cleaning supplies, Lena felt the weight of questions she couldn't ask, mysteries she couldn't solve. But more than that, she felt the pull of genuine curiosity about this man who had somehow earned her grandmother's recognition, who lived with such careful simplicity in a place that seemed to hold deeper secrets. "I hope your horse recovers," she said as she prepared to leave. "She will," Weston replied with quiet confidence. "Some things just take time and patience." Driving back toward town, Lena found herself thinking about patience, about the kind of man who would choose such isolation, who would build such a carefully maintained life away from the world, who would inspire such loyalty in the people who knew him. She thought about her grandmother's words, about quiet philanthropy and the Clay family legacy, and wondered what connections might exist between past and present. Most of all, she thought about the way Weston Clay had looked at her, not with the casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to from wealthy lodge guests, but with the respectful attention of someone who saw her as a person worth knowing. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her that way, and even longer since she'd felt the stirring of genuine curiosity about another person's story. As the ranch disappeared behind the ridge, Lena carried with her the first threads of a mystery that would soon unravel everything she thought she knew about wealth, secrecy, and the man who lived alone among the Montana mountains. 3 days later, Lena found herself driving back up Copper Creek Road, the borrowed pickup truck's engine laboring against the steep grade. This time, it wasn't a one-time favor. Weston had called Harold specifically to request her services for what he'd described as a deeper cleaning project that might take several days. The extra income was a godsend, arriving just as her grandmother's latest medical bills had pushed their monthly budget past the breaking point. The ranch looked different in the morning light, more settled somehow, as if the buildings had grown from the landscape itself rather than being imposed upon it. Weston emerged from the main house as she parked, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the same expression of quiet courtesy she remembered from their first meeting. "Morning, Lena," he said, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I appreciate you coming back out here." "Of course," she replied, gathering her expanded array of cleaning supplies. "What kind of deeper cleaning did you have in mind?" Weston gestured toward the large barn that dominated the northern edge of the compound. "I'm finally getting around to organizing some storage areas that have been neglected too long. Nothing fancy, just need someone trustworthy to help sort through things and clean as we go." As they walked toward the barn, Lena noticed details she'd missed during her first visit. The outbuildings were more numerous and substantial than they'd appeared from a distance. A workshop, what looked like a generator house, and several smaller structures whose purposes weren't immediately obvious. Everything was immaculately maintained, but there was something about the arrangement that suggested function over form, purpose over aesthetics. The barn itself was impressive, its interior far more sophisticated than the rustic exterior suggested. The main floor housed several horses in spacious stalls, along with feed storage and the usual array of ranch equipment. But Lena's attention was drawn to the far end of the building, where a section had been walled off with newer lumber. "That's the area I need help with," Weston said, following her gaze. "Storage space I sectioned off a few years back. It's gotten cluttered." He led her to what appeared to be a standard door, but as he approached, Lena noticed the subtle gleam of an electronic lock panel partially concealed by the frame. Weston's fingers moved across it with practiced ease, and the door opened with the quiet whisper of well-oiled hinges. What lay beyond took her breath away. The storage area was actually a staircase leading down into what could only be described as an underground office complex. The walls were lined with natural stone, professionally lit and climate-controlled. As they descended, Lena could see that the space extended far beyond what should have been possible under a simple barn. "This is incredible," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the space. "How did you—" "Built it when I renovated the property," Weston said, his tone carefully neutral. "Montana winters can be long. A man needs a place to work on projects." The main room opened before them like something from a different world. One wall was dominated by an array of monitors and what appeared to be sophisticated communication equipment. Filing cabinets lined another wall, their surfaces bearing labels in a neat, precise hand. A large conference table occupied the center of the space, its surface covered with maps, documents, and what looked like architectural plans, but it was the third wall that made Lena's breath catch. It was covered floor to ceiling with what appeared to be land deeds, property records, and documents bearing official seals. Between these were photographs, aerial shots of vast tracts of wilderness, ground-level images of pristine forests and untouched valleys, and pictures of what looked like conservation projects in various stages of completion. "Mr. Clay," Lena said slowly, "what exactly is all this?" Weston moved to the conference table, his hands resting on its polished surface. For a long moment he stood silent, and Lena could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the careful calculation of someone unaccustomed to sharing secrets. "This is my real work," he said finally. "Everything else, the ranch, the cattle, the simple cowboy routine, that's just cover." Lena moved closer to the wall of documents, her eyes scanning the official letterheads, the environmental impact studies, the correspondence from organizations she recognized as major conservation groups. One document in particular caught her attention, a letter from the World Wildlife Fund thanking Mr. W. Clay for his unprecedented anonymous contribution to their Endangered Species Preservation Fund. "You're not just a rancher," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "No," Weston replied, "I'm not." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Lena found herself studying the man who had seemed so straightforward, so unassuming, trying to reconcile the humble cowboy with the sophisticated operations surrounding them. "The amount of money represented here," she said, gesturing at the documents. "This isn't just wealth. This is a fortune," Weston finished. "A very large fortune dedicated to land conservation, wildlife preservation, and anonymous assistance to struggling rural communities." Lena sank into one of the chairs around the conference table, her mind reeling. "How long have you been doing this?" 15 years here in Montana, but the foundation work started long before that. My family has been involved in conservation and quiet philanthropy for 3 generations. She looked around the room again, seeing it now with different eyes. The communication equipment that could coordinate projects across continents. The maps marking properties that probably represented millions of acres. The filing system that spoke of meticulous record-keeping for what must be countless ongoing projects. "Why the secrecy?" she asked. "If you're doing all this good work, why hide it?" Weston's expression darkened, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw pain flicker across his features. "Because public recognition comes with costs I'm not willing to pay. Because once your name is attached to this kind of wealth, you become a target for every opportunist, every person with a sob story, every organization looking for an easy donation. And because..." He paused, moving to one of the filing cabinets, and withdrawing a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. He handed it to Lena without speaking. The headline read, "Philanthropist's Wife, Killed in Robbery Attempt." Below it was a photograph of a younger Weston standing beside a beautiful woman, with kind eyes and a warm smile. The article described how Margaret Clay, wife of prominent businessman and philanthropist Weston Clay, had been murdered during a botched kidnapping attempt outside their Boston home. The perpetrators had apparently believed her husband's wealth made her a valuable target. "I'm so sorry," Lena said, her voice thick with sympathy. "After Margaret died, I realized that visibility is dangerous, not just for me, but for anyone close to me. So I disappeared, legally transferred everything to a series of trusts and shell companies, changed my public profile, and became just another rancher in Montana. The work continues, but I stay invisible." Lena set the clipping down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "All those land deeds on the wall, you own all that property." "The foundation owns it. Hundreds of thousands of acres across 7 states, all protected in perpetuity. Plus the anonymous donations to environmental groups, the quiet assistance to family farms facing foreclosure, the funding for rural school programs that would otherwise be cut." She stood and walked to the wall of documents, studying them more carefully now. Mixed among the official papers were what appeared to be thank you letters, handwritten notes from families expressing gratitude for anonymous help that had saved their farms, their businesses, their communities. "You've been helping people all along," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "The stories my grandmother told about the Clay family's quiet philanthropy, that was your family. Very likely. My father believed in helping people without fanfare, without recognition. He said the moment you start doing good works for public approval, you've lost sight of what matters. Lena turned back to face him, seeing him now as if for the first time. But you trusted me with this. Why? Weston considered the question carefully. Because Sarah Miller vouched for you completely. Because your grandmother has a reputation for integrity that goes back decades. And because, he paused, searching for words, because sometimes a secret becomes too heavy to carry alone. The implications of what he'd shared began to settle over Lena like a weight. Here was a man who could solve her family's problems with a simple check, who could fund her brother's education without noticing the expense, who could pay for her grandmother's medical care as easily as buying groceries. But asking for such help would violate everything she believed about dignity and self-reliance. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll keep this confidential, Weston replied. Say you understand why it has to stay secret. Of course, she said quickly. But Mr. Clay, Weston, this is incredible. The good you're doing, the lives you're changing. People should know. No, he said firmly. They shouldn't. The moment this becomes public knowledge, everything changes. The effectiveness ends, the safety disappears, and people like you, people I might care about, become targets. The way he said, people I might care about, sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that suggested she'd moved beyond simply being his trusted cleaner. So what happens now? She asked. Now you help me organize some of these files, he said with a slight smile. And now you know why I live the way I do, why I keep to myself, why I'm careful about who I let close, why I've spent 15 years building a life based on useful deception. As they began working through the documents, Lena found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. The careful rancher's facade had fallen away, replaced by someone more complex, a brilliant strategist who'd found a way to use vast wealth for good while maintaining the anonymity necessary for both effectiveness and safety. But even as she marveled at the scope of his work, she couldn't shake the image of that newspaper clipping, the young woman who died simply because she'd been connected to Weston's public philanthropy. The price of visibility had been paid in blood, and now she understood the true cost of the secret she'd been trusted to keep. The afternoon passed in a haze of revelation and organization. Each file told a story of careful intervention, a struggling ranch saved from foreclosure, a rare ecosystem purchased and preserved, a rural school's science program quietly funded. By the time they finished, Lena's understanding of Weston Clay had been completely transformed. As they climbed back toward ground level, she found herself wondering how many other secrets lay hidden beneath the simple surface of his ranch life, and what it might mean to be trusted with the truth about one of the most carefully guarded philanthropic operations in the country. The barn's main floor seemed almost mundane after the sophistication of the underground complex. But as Weston secured the hidden entrance, Lena realized that her own life had been irrevocably changed. She now carried knowledge that could alter the fate of conservation efforts across multiple states, and she carried it alone with a man who'd chosen to trust her with everything he'd worked to protect. This doesn't change anything between us, Weston said as they stood beside her truck. I still need someone trustworthy to help with the ranch work. You still need the employment. But now you understand why trust matters so much to me. Lena nodded, but she knew he was wrong. Everything had changed. The simple transaction of work for wages had become something far more complex, weighted with secrets and trust, and the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to genuine connection. As she drove home through the gathering dusk, Lena carried with her the burden and privilege of knowledge that could change everything. For Weston, for the countless lives his work touched, and for her own family's desperate circumstances. The question that haunted her during the long drive back to town was simple, but overwhelming. What was she supposed to do with a secret this big? Sleep eluded Lena that night. She lay in her narrow bed above Murphy's General Store, staring at the ceiling while her mind churned through everything she'd learned. The weight of Weston's secret felt almost physical, pressing against her chest, like a stone. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the underground complex, the wall of conservation documents, the newspaper clipping with its terrible headline. By morning, she'd reached a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would return to the ranch and ask Weston to explain more, not because she doubted what he'd shown her, but because she needed to understand the full scope of what she'd become part of. The drive to Copper Creek Road felt different this time, charged with purpose rather than simple obligation. She found Weston in the main corral, working with a young horse that clearly trusted him completely. The sight of him, patient, gentle, completely focused on the animal's needs, somehow made the previous day's revelations feel more real rather than less. "I was hoping you'd come back," he said when he noticed her approach. His voice carried a note of uncertainty she hadn't heard before, as if he'd spent the night wondering whether he'd made a terrible mistake in trusting her. "I have questions," Lena said simply. Weston nodded, leading the horse back to its stall. "I figured you might. Come on, let's talk properly." They settled on the front porch of the main house, coffee mugs warming their hands in the crisp morning air. The view stretched for miles across the valley, an expanse of protected wilderness that took on new meaning now that Lena understood Weston's role in preserving it. "Tell me about the foundation," she said. "How does it actually work?" Weston was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "It's called the Clearwater Conservation Trust. Technically, I don't own any of it. I'm just the primary trustee. The structure was designed by some very expensive lawyers to ensure anonymity while maintaining legal compliance." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. "Last year alone, we acquired 43,000 acres across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, all of it designated as permanent conservation land. We also provided anonymous assistance to 18 family farms facing foreclosure and funded environmental education programs in 37 rural schools." The numbers were staggering. Lena tried to comprehend the scale of impact represented by those quiet statistics. "How much money are we talking about?" "The Trust's current assets are just over $800 million. Weston said matter-of-factly. "But it's not about the money itself. It's about what the money can protect. Every acre we preserve, every family farm we save, every environmental program we fund, that's wealth that actually matters." Lena set down her coffee mug, her hands trembling slightly. $800 million, give or take," Weston said with a slight smile. "It fluctuates with investments." She found herself thinking about her grandmother's medical bills, $23,000 that had seemed insurmountable, about her brother's college expenses that kept him awake at night with worry, about the families in their community who'd lost farms, businesses, dreams to economic pressures that Weston could address with what amounted to pocket change. "You could solve so many problems," she said softly, "for people like my family, like my neighbors." "And I do," Weston replied, "just not directly and not visibly. The Clearwater Trust has probably helped your community more than you realize." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim folder, handing it to her. Inside were documents she recognized, records from the county assessor's office, bank correspondence, municipal meeting minutes. "Your town's elementary school," Weston said as she read. 3 years ago, it was scheduled for closure due to budget cuts. An anonymous donation of $200,000 allowed it to stay open and upgrade its science lab. Lena remembered the celebration when the school had announced the mysterious benefactor. The entire community had wondered about the identity of their guardian angel. "The Morrison family ranch," Weston continued. "Last year, facing foreclosure, an anonymous buyer purchased their debt and restructured it at favorable terms, allowing them to keep the land their family had worked for 4 generations. She knew the Morrisons, had gone to school with their daughter, had watched Tom Morrison's face at church as he'd struggled with the prospect of losing everything. The regional food bank, Weston said. Regular anonymous contributions that have allowed them to expand services throughout the valley. With each revelation, Lena felt the scope of Weston's quiet influence expanding. He hadn't just hidden himself away on a remote ranch. He'd been systematically, carefully improving the lives of everyone around him while maintaining complete invisibility. "How do you decide?" she asked. "How do you choose who to help?" "Research," Weston said. "Lots of research. I have people who investigate situations quietly, verify need, ensure that assistance will actually solve problems rather than create dependency. It's not random charity, it's strategic intervention." The phrase, "I have people," caught her attention. "You're not doing this alone." "No. There's a small team of investigators, lawyers, and financial advisors who help coordinate everything. They think they work for various shell companies and law firms. Only 3 people know that all the threads lead back to me." "And now 4, Lena said. "Now 4, he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher. Over the mountains, Lena found herself studying Weston's profile, trying to reconcile the humble rancher with the architect of such massive generosity. There was something deeply attractive about a man who wielded such power so quietly, who chose service over recognition. "Why did you really tell me?" she asked. "The real reason." Weston turned to meet her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that he'd kept carefully hidden. "Because 15 years of carrying this alone has been harder than I expected. Because you're the first person I've met who I thought might understand the responsibility without being corrupted by it. And because," he paused, searching for words, "because I've been wondering what it might be like to share this work with someone I trust completely." The implications of that statement sent a flutter of something through Lena's chest. Part excitement, part terror. "You're talking about partnership." "I'm talking about the possibility of partnership," Weston clarified. "If you're interested, if you think you could handle the secrecy, the responsibility, the careful balance of helping people without them knowing where the help comes from." Lena stood and moved to the porch railing, needing distance to think clearly. The offer was extraordinary, a chance to be part of something that could change countless lives, to work alongside a man who'd found a way to use tremendous wealth for genuine good. But it would also mean embracing a life of secrets, of careful deceptions, of constant vigilance about who could be trusted with the truth. "What would that look like?" she asked. "You'd help coordinate some of the regional projects," Weston said. "Your connection to the community, your understanding of local needs, would make the assistance more effective. You'd help identify families and organizations that could benefit from anonymous help, and you'd help manage the day-to-day operations that keep the foundation running. And in return, you'd be compensated appropriately for your work. Your grandmother's medical expenses would be covered through one of the foundation's healthcare assistance programs. Your brother's education would be funded through our rural scholarship initiative. Your family's financial pressures would disappear, but in a way that preserves your dignity and independence." It was everything she'd dreamed of, offered in a way that honored her values. But Lena found herself thinking about the newspaper clipping, about Margaret Clay's tragic death, about the price of becoming close to someone with so many secrets. "It's dangerous," she said. "It can be," Weston admitted, "but the danger comes from exposure, from becoming publicly connected to the wealth. As long as we maintain the careful boundaries I've established, the risk is minimal." Lena turned back to face him, seeing the hope in his expression despite his careful tone. He wanted her to say yes, not just for the practical benefits she could bring to his work, but for the companionship, the shared purpose, the possibility of connection with someone who understood the weight he carried. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course," Weston replied. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." As she prepared to leave, he handed her another folder, this one containing detailed information about several upcoming projects in their region. "Read through these," he said. "See if this is work that speaks to you." Driving home, Lena carried with her not just the burden of Weston's secret, but the possibility of a completely different future. A future where her family's struggles could end, where she could be part of work that mattered on a scale she'd never imagined, where she could build something meaningful with a man who'd shown her trust beyond anything she'd ever experienced. But it would require stepping into a world of careful lies and hidden truths, of constant vigilance and calculated risks. It would mean embracing a life where her closest relationships would always carry the weight of secrets, where simple honesty would become a luxury she could rarely afford. The choice before her was as daunting as it was tempting, and she knew that whatever she decided would change not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she cared about. The folder Weston had given her remained unopened on Lena's kitchen table for 2 days. Each time she passed it, she felt the pull of curiosity warring with the weight of what opening it would represent. Once she read those project details, once she truly understood the scope of what he was offering, there would be no pretending that her life could remain unchanged. It was her brother Danny who finally forced the decision. He appeared at her apartment late Thursday evening, his usual optimism replaced by a careful blankness that she recognized as his way of hiding disappointment. "I need to tell you something," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "About school." Lena's heart sank. "What happened?" "Nothing bad exactly. It's just, I've been doing the math, and even with my partial scholarship, the living expenses are more than we calculated. If I'm going to stay enrolled next semester, we need to find another way to cover about $4,000. $4,000. Not an enormous sum in the abstract, but in their current circumstances, it might as well have been 40,000. Lena had already taken on every extra shift at the lodge, had already stretched their budget to its absolute limit. "I could take a semester off," Danny continued, his voice carefully controlled. "Work full-time, save money, maybe reapply for additional financial aid." "No," Lena said firmly. "You're not dropping out." "Lena, be realistic. We can't—" "I said no." She reached for the folder, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "Let me read something first." The project documents were meticulously organized, each one representing a careful intervention in lives and communities across the region. The first detailed a scholarship program for rural students that provided not just tuition assistance, but living stipends, textbook allowances, and mentorship support. The criteria for eligibility described Danny's situation perfectly. The second document outlined a healthcare assistance program that covered medical expenses for elderly residents in rural communities. Lena found herself reading the eligibility requirements with growing amazement. Her grandmother qualified for everything from prescription coverage to in-home care support. But it was the third document that took her breath away. It described a community development initiative focused on supporting local businesses and organizations that served working families. One section specifically mentioned funding for expansion of cleaning and hospitality services, including training, programs and equipment grants that could transform someone's part-time work into a sustainable business. "Danny," she said slowly, "what would you say if I told you I might have found a way to solve our problems?" Her brother looked up from his textbook, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. "I'd say it sounds too good to be true." "It might be," Lena admitted, "but it might also be exactly what we need." That night, after Danny had returned to his dorm room with cautious optimism about staying in school, Lena found herself walking through the quiet streets of their small town. She passed the elementary school that had been saved by anonymous donation, the Morrison Ranch, where the family still didn't know who had rescued them from foreclosure, the food bank that had doubled its services thanks to mysterious benefactors. She was seeing her community through new eyes, not just as a place where people struggled, but as a place where someone had been quietly, systematically working to make those struggles more bearable. Weston hadn't just hidden himself away in the mountains. He'd been watching over the valley like some kind of guardian angel, using his vast resources to solve problems that local government and traditional charities couldn't address. The next morning, she called the ranch. "I'd like to come out and discuss your offer," she said when Weston answered. "Of course," he replied, and she could hear the relief in his voice. Would this afternoon work? She found him in the underground complex this time, surrounded by maps and documents that spoke of projects spanning multiple states. He looked up as she descended the stairs, his expression carefully neutral despite the hope she could see in his eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said," Lena began, "about partnership, about sharing this work, and I want to understand exactly what I'd be signing up for. Not just the benefits, but the responsibilities, the risks." Weston nodded, gesturing for her to join him at the conference table. "Fair enough. Let me show you what a typical month looks like." For the next 2 hours, he walked her through the intricate machinery of his philanthropic empire. She learned about the network of investigators who identified needs and verified circumstances. She saw the careful protocols that ensured anonymity while maintaining legal compliance. She understood the delicate balance between helping people and avoiding the creation of dependency. Most importantly, she began to grasp the emotional weight of the work. Every decision affected real lives. The choice to save one farm might mean leaving another family to struggle. The allocation of resources to education programs might delay environmental protection efforts. Weston carried the burden of these choices daily, making decisions that would ripple through communities for generations. "The hardest part," he said, showing her a file of applications for assistance, "is knowing that we can't help everyone. The requests for aid always exceed our capacity, no matter how much money we have. You have to learn to live with the knowledge that saying yes to one family means saying no to another." Lena studied the applications. Handwritten letters from farmers facing drought, formal proposals from schools needing equipment, desperate pleas from families dealing with medical crises. Each one represented real people, real struggles, real hope for intervention. "How do you choose?" she asked. "Criteria," Weston replied. "We prioritize situations where our assistance will have the greatest long-term impact, where people are working hard to solve their own problems, but need temporary support to succeed. We avoid creating cycles of dependence, and we always maintain anonymity." He pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with careful notations in his precise handwriting. "This is the real artifact of our work," he said. "Every donation, every intervention, every life touched by the foundation. My father kept a similar record, and his father before him. It's our family's true legacy." Lena opened the ledger carefully, scanning entries that went back more than a decade. Each line represented a decision, a family helped, a crisis averted. The scope was overwhelming, hundreds of interventions, millions of dollars quietly deployed to solve problems and preserve communities. "If I agree to this," she said, "if I become part of this work, what happens to my normal life, my job at the lodge, my relationships, my identity as just Lena Maris who cleans houses and worries about bills?" "That person doesn't disappear," Weston said. "She becomes your cover story, your connection to the community we serve. But yes, everything changes. You'll carry secrets that affect thousands of lives. You'll make decisions that require wisdom beyond your years. And you'll always have to be careful about who you trust, who you let close, who might accidentally discover what we're really doing." Lena closed the ledger, her decision crystallizing. "My grandmother always told me that with privilege comes responsibility. I never understood what she meant because I never thought I'd have privilege. But this, being trusted with this work, being offered partnership in something this important, this is privilege." Yes, Weston said simply. It is. And the responsibility is to use it well, to help people without seeking recognition, to carry the burden of secrecy for the greater good. That's exactly right. Lena looked around the underground complex, at the maps and documents and communication equipment that connected this hidden place to a network of good work spanning multiple states. She thought about her grandmother's medical bills, her brother's education, her own dreams of building something meaningful with her life. But more than that, she thought about the families she could help, the communities she could strengthen, the conservation work she could support. I have conditions, she said. Weston leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm listening. First, we help my family through the Foundation's existing programs, not through special arrangements. They qualify for the assistance legitimately, and I want them to receive it the same way any other eligible family would. Agreed. Second, I want to maintain my job at the lodge for now. I need the cover story, and I need time to transition into this new role gradually. That makes sense. Third, I want to understand the security protocols completely. If I'm going to carry secrets this important, I need to know how to protect them properly. Absolutely. Lena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a mantle. Then yes, I want to be part of this work. Weston's smile broadened, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw pure, unguarded happiness in his expression. Welcome to the Clearwater Conservation Trust, Lena. I think we're going to do extraordinary things together. As they shook hands across the conference table, Lena felt the last threads of her old life slipping away. She was no longer just a hotel cleaner struggling to support her family. She was the newest member of one of the most secretive and effective philanthropic operations in the country. The knowledge was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Outside, the Montana sun was setting over the protected wilderness that stretched to the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful enough to make her breath catch, and now she knew that she would be helping to ensure that view remained unchanged for generations to come. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but for the first time in years, Lena felt hopeful about the future, not just for herself and her family, but for all the lives they would touch through their careful, anonymous work. She was about to become part of something larger than herself, something that mattered in ways she was only beginning to understand. 2 weeks into her new role with the Clearwater Conservation Trust, Lena was beginning to understand the intricate choreography required to live a double life. Her days at Pine Ridge Lodge continued as before, cleaning guest rooms, organizing linens, maintaining the facade of simple employment. But her evenings and weekends had transformed into something she could never have imagined. She spent hours in Weston's underground complex, learning to navigate the Foundation's sophisticated database of projects and beneficiaries. She reviewed applications for assistance, conducted discreet research on families and organizations seeking help, and began to understand the careful protocols that kept their work invisible to the outside world. The learning curve was steep, but Lena found herself energized by the complexity of the work. Each case required not just financial analysis, but deep understanding of community dynamics, family structures, and the delicate balance between assistance and interference. It was during one of these evening sessions that Weston first shared the story behind his greatest burden. "There's something else you need to understand," he said, pulling a worn manila folder from a locked drawer she hadn't noticed before. "About why I'm so careful, why the security measures exist, why I chose isolation over any other way of life." The folder contained newspaper clippings, police reports, and what appeared to be FBI correspondence. All of it centered on the months following Margaret Clay's murder 15 years earlier. "After Margaret died," Weston said, his voice carefully controlled, "I thought the solution was better security, bodyguards, surveillance, protected environments. I tried to continue the public philanthropy work while keeping myself and anyone close to me safe. Lena read through the documents with growing horror. In the 6 months after his wife's death, there had been 3 more attempts on Weston's life. 2 potential kidnapping plots targeting his household staff had been foiled by law enforcement. A bomb had been discovered in his car. The threats had escalated rather than diminished, as word spread through criminal networks about the wealthy philanthropist who might be vulnerable to extortion. The FBI told me I had 2 choices, Weston continued. Live in a fortress for the rest of my life, or disappear completely. I chose to disappear. He showed her the careful documentation of his public death. Not literally, but the systematic. Dismantling of Weston Clay, the visible philanthropist. Assets transferred to anonymous trusts, public appearances gradually reduced to nothing, media attention allowed to fade until the world simply forgot that he existed. It took 3 years to complete the transition, he said. 3 years of gradually becoming invisible while maintaining the foundation's work through intermediaries and shell companies. By the time I bought this ranch and became just another Millionaire Cowboy, Weston Clay, the philanthropist, had effectively ceased to exist. Lena set down the FBI correspondence, her hands trembling slightly. The danger isn't theoretical. No, it's not. The moment our work becomes publicly connected to a visible person with identifiable wealth, the threats begin again. It's not just about robbery or kidnapping. It's about extortion, manipulation, violence used as leverage to access resources that criminals see as unlimited. The weight of what she'd agreed to participate in suddenly felt much heavier. And by becoming your partner, I put myself at risk. You put yourself at risk only if we're exposed, Weston clarified. As long as we maintain the careful boundaries, as long as Lena Maris remains a hotel cleaner who sometimes does ranch work, the danger stays theoretical. But even as he said it, Lena could see the concern in his expression. He was worried about her safety, about what he'd drawn her into, about the possibility that his need for companionship might compromise the security they both depended on. "Show me the protocols," she said. "All of them." For the next hour, Weston walked her through security measures she hadn't fully appreciated. The ranch's isolation wasn't just preference, it was strategic positioning that allowed for early detection of approaching threats. The sophisticated communication equipment included encryption capabilities and emergency broadcasting systems. Even his choice of vehicles, his shopping habits, his interactions with neighbors were all carefully calculated to maintain his cover identity while preserving operational security. The hardest part, he admitted, is the constant vigilance. Every new person you meet is a potential security risk. Every relationship has to be evaluated for vulnerabilities. Every moment of genuine connection carries the weight of wondering whether you're putting someone in danger. Lena understood now why he'd seemed so cautious during their early interactions, why he'd taken such care in verifying her trustworthiness through Sarah Miller and community connections. She also understood the courage it had taken for him to share his secret, to risk both operational security and personal safety for the possibility of partnership. "There's something else," Weston said, hesitating as if unsure whether to continue. "Something I found when I was researching your background." He handed her a slim file bearing her grandmother's name. Inside were documents she'd never seen, medical records, correspondence with insurance companies, and what appeared to be investigation reports. "Your grandmother's illness," Weston said gently. "The lung condition that's been getting worse over the past 2 years." "What about it?" Lena asked, though she already felt dread building in her chest. "It's not natural deterioration. She was exposed to industrial chemicals during her years at the canning factory. The company knew the chemicals were dangerous, but didn't provide adequate protection for workers. She's essentially been poisoned, slowly, over decades." Lena stared at the medical reports, seeing her grandmother's suffering in a completely new light. "The company is responsible. The company is gone, sold and dissolved years ago. but the legal liability passed to the parent corporation, which still exists and has substantial assets. Your grandmother, along with dozens of other former workers, has a legitimate claim for medical expenses and compensation. Why are you telling me this? Weston's expression was serious, almost pained. Because I've been funding a legal investigation into the case. Not through the foundation. This is personal research I've been conducting for the past year. I think we can build a case that provides justice for your grandmother and the other victims. The revelation hit Lena like a physical blow. You've been investigating my family's situation since before we met? Not investigating your family, Weston said quickly. Investigating the industrial poisoning case. Your grandmother's situation came to light as part of that research. When Sarah Miller mentioned you as a potential cleaning service, I realized the connection. Lena stood and moved away from the table, needing space to process what she'd learned. So this whole thing, hiring me, sharing your secret, offering partnership, was that all planned? No, Weston said firmly. The job offer was legitimate need after Sarah's house flooded. Everything else developed naturally. But yes, I was already aware of your family's medical situation, and yes, I was already working on a way to address the injustice your grandmother has suffered. The complexity of emotions Lena felt was overwhelming. Gratitude for Weston's concern and investigation, anger at being studied without her knowledge, relief that her grandmother's suffering might finally have an explanation and potential resolution, and underneath it all, a growing awareness that her connection to Weston was deeper and more complicated than either of them had initially realized. The legal case, she said finally. What would it involve? Depositions, medical testimony, document review. It would probably take 2 years to reach settlement, but the compensation could be substantial. Enough to cover all of your grandmother's medical expenses and provide financial security for her remaining years. And it would be public. Court records, media attention, our names connected to a major legal settlement. Yes, Weston admitted. It would compromise the anonymity we need for the foundation work. Lena saw the dilemma clearly now. Justice for her grandmother would require exactly the kind of public visibility that made their conservation work impossible. The choice between family and mission, between personal justice and greater good, between the life she'd always known and the secret world she'd just entered. What do you think I should do? She asked. Weston was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the careful attention she'd come to associate with his most serious decisions. I think you should choose what feels right to you. Whatever you decide, we'll find a way to make it work. But Lena could see the concern in his expression, the understanding that some choices couldn't be easily reconciled. The weight of secrets was already heavy. The weight of choosing between competing loyalties might prove unbearable. As she drove home that night, Lena carried with her not just the burden of Weston's trust, but the complexity of a relationship that had begun with simple employment and evolved into something that touched every aspect of her life. The newspaper clipping with its tragic headline seemed less like history and more like prophecy, a warning about the price of getting too close to someone whose life was built on carefully maintained secrets. The question that haunted her during the long drive back to town was whether love and partnership could survive in a world where every genuine connection carried the risk of exposure, and where exposure could mean the difference between life and death. The conversation with her grandmother came 3 days later, prompted by Elena's gradual decline and Lena's growing need to understand the full scope of what Weston had uncovered. She found her grandmother in the small garden behind their apartment building, tending to tomato plants with the patient care of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. "Grandma," Lena said, settling onto the wooden bench beside her, "I need to ask you about the canning factory." Elena's hands stilled on the tomato vines, and for a moment her expression carried the weight of memories carefully buried. "That's not something I talk about much. I know, but I think it might be important now. Over the next hour, Elena shared stories that Lena had never heard, about the long shifts in poorly ventilated buildings, the chemical smells that burned their throats and made their eyes water, the company supervisors who assured workers that everything was safe, despite the obvious signs that it wasn't. "We needed the work," Elena said simply. "Your grandfather was hurt in the mining accident, couldn't do physical labor anymore. The factory paid decent wages for women's work, and they didn't ask too many questions about education or background. We knew it wasn't healthy, but we told ourselves it was temporary." 23 years isn't temporary, Lena said gently. "No, it's not. But by the time we understood how dangerous it really was, too many families depended on those jobs. The whole community would have collapsed if the factory closed." Lena thought about Weston's investigation, about the legal case that could provide justice and compensation for her grandmother's suffering. What if there was a way to hold the company responsible, to get compensation for the medical expenses, the ongoing care you need? Elena turned to study her granddaughter's face with the sharp attention that age and wisdom had taught her. What kind of way? A legal case, lawyers who specialize in industrial poisoning, evidence that the company knew their chemicals were dangerous and chose not to protect their workers. And you know about this how? Lena felt the weight of secrets pressing against her chest. She'd promised Weston complete confidentiality, but sitting here with her grandmother, watching the labored breathing, seeing the frail hands that had worked so hard for so many years, the promise felt less absolute. "Someone I work for has been investigating the factory situation," she said carefully. "Not specifically our family, but the broader case of worker exposure. He thinks there's strong evidence for legal action." Elena was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the garden that had given her so much pleasure despite her declining health. "This someone you work for. He's not just your employer." "Is he?" The question caught Lena off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been different these past few weeks. Happier, but also more worried. Like someone who's discovered something important but complicated. And now you're talking about legal investigations that could change everything for our family. That's not the kind of thing that comes from cleaning hotel rooms." Lena realized she'd underestimated her grandmother's perceptiveness. Elena had spent 78 years reading people, understanding the currents that move beneath surface. Conversations. The changes in Lena's life hadn't gone unnoticed. "It's complicated," Lena said finally. "Most important things are," Eleanor replied. "Tell me about him." So Lena found herself sharing carefully edited pieces of the truth. She described Weston's ranch, his quiet demeanor, his obvious intelligence and education. She explained how he'd offered her additional work, how that had led to conversations about community issues, how his interest in helping people had connected to research about the factory. What she couldn't share was the scope of his wealth, the underground complex, the conservation empire that spanned multiple states. But even the partial truth she offered painted a picture of someone significant, someone who'd become important to her in ways that went beyond employment. "You care about him," Elena observed. "Yes," Lena admitted. "I do, and he cares about you." "I think so? I hope so." Elena nodded slowly, understanding more than Lena had actually said. "The legal case, pursuing it would mean publicity, wouldn't it? Court records, maybe newspaper coverage? Probably. And that would be a problem for him? For the work he does?" Again, Lena was struck by her grandmother's intuitive grasp of situations. She couldn't fully explain. "It could be, yes." "Then you have a choice to make," Elena said gently, "between what might be good for our family and what might be good for the work that matters to him." That evening, Lena returned to the ranch with a heavy heart and a decision that felt both clear and impossible. She found Weston in the main house, reviewing what appeared to be architectural plans for a conservation project in Wyoming. "I've been thinking about the legal case," she said without preamble. Weston set down the plans, giving her his complete attention. "And I want to pursue it, but not now. Not while I'm part of the foundation work. The publicity would compromise everything we're trying to build. Lena, you don't have to sacrifice your family's interests for... I'm not sacrificing anything, she interrupted. I'm choosing priorities. My grandmother has lived with this situation for decades. She can continue receiving medical care through the Foundation's healthcare assistance programs. The justice can wait until we find a way to pursue it that doesn't threaten the conservation work. Weston studied her face carefully. Are you sure about this? Once we postpone the legal action, there's no guarantee we'll be able to pursue it later. Evidence degrades, witnesses become unavailable, legal windows close. I'm sure, Lena said, though the words felt heavier than she'd expected. The Foundation helps hundreds of families. I can't put that at risk for one case, even if it's my own family's case. The relief in Weston's expression was unmistakable, followed immediately by something that looked like admiration. Thank you, he said quietly. That's the kind of decision that shows real understanding of what this work means. Don't thank me yet, Lena replied. I have conditions. Name them. First, we document everything about my grandmother's case completely. All the evidence, all the research, all the legal analysis. If the Foundation's work ever ends or changes, if circumstances allow us to pursue justice later, I want everything preserved and ready. Absolutely. Second, we establish a healthcare assistance program specifically for industrial poisoning victims. Other families affected by the factory, other workers dealing with similar situations elsewhere. We use the Foundation's resources to address the broader injustice, even if we can't pursue individual legal cases. Weston's smile was genuine and warm. That's brilliant. It addresses the systemic problem while maintaining our operational security. And third, Lena said, her voice softer now, we find ways to spend more time together that don't involve work. If we're going to be partners in this foundation, if we're going to carry these secrets together, I need to know who you are, beyond the philanthropy and the security protocols. What did you have in mind? Dinner, real dates, even if they have, to be carefully managed for security. Conversations about things other than conservation projects and donation strategies. Time to discover whether what's growing between us can survive outside the context of shared work. Weston reached across the table to take her hands, and Lena felt the familiar flutter of attraction mixed with the deeper satisfaction of genuine partnership. I'd like that very much, he said, though I should warn you, I'm probably rusty at normal relationship dynamics. We'll figure it out together, Lena replied, just like everything else. That night, as they worked side by side reviewing applications for conservation land purchases, Lena felt the foundation of something solid building between them. It wasn't just romantic attraction, though that was certainly present. It wasn't just shared purpose, though their work together mattered more than anything she'd ever been part of. It was the recognition that they were building something rare, a partnership based on complete trust, shared values, and the kind of understanding that came from choosing each other despite the complications. But even as she felt their relationship deepening, Lena carried with her the weight of the choice she'd made. Justice for her grandmother remained postponed, possibly forever. The legal case that could provide both compensation and acknowledgement of suffering would wait indefinitely for circumstances that might never align. She'd chosen the greater good over personal justice, and while the decision felt right, it also felt like the first real sacrifice their partnership had required. She wondered how many more such choices lay ahead, and whether love could survive the accumulating weight of compromises made in service of secrets that could never be fully shared. Outside the ranch house windows, the Montana wilderness stretched, endlessly under starlight, protected and preserved through careful work that required exactly the kind of invisible sacrifice she was learning to make. It was beautiful and purposeful and worth protecting, but it was also lonely in ways she was only beginning to understand. 6 weeks into their deepening partnership, Lena had begun to believe that they'd found the perfect balance. Her days at Pine Ridge Lodge provided ideal cover for her real work with the foundation, while her evenings at the ranch had evolved into a careful blend of conservation planning and personal connection. They'd managed 3 proper dinner dates, carefully arranged at remote restaurants where Weston's face wouldn't be recognized, and each had revealed new layers of the man beneath the philanthropist's careful facade. It was during one of these, quiet evenings, that their carefully constructed world began to unravel. Lena was in the lodge's main kitchen, helping Maria prepare for the next day's breakfast service, when a guest approached the service counter with the confident stride of someone accustomed to immediate attention. He was younger than most of their clientele, perhaps 40, with the kind of expensive casual clothing that marked him as East Coast money rather than Western wealth. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who'd attended the right schools. "I'm trying to locate someone who might be working in the area, a researcher or consultant, possibly going by the name Clay." Lena felt her blood freeze, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry. We don't typically provide information about local residents to guests. Is there something specific I can help you with?" The man smiled, but it was the practiced expression of someone who sold things for a living rather than genuine warmth. "Of course, I understand the privacy concerns. Let me introduce myself properly. I'm Marcus Vaughan, investigative reporter with the Financial Times. I'm working on a story about environmental philanthropy in the American West." He handed Lena a business card that confirmed his credentials, along with a photograph that made her knees weak. It was clearly Weston, but from years earlier, a professional headshot that showed him in expensive business attire, looking every inch the wealthy philanthropist he'd once been publicly. "This photograph was taken about 20 years ago," Vaughan continued, "but facial recognition software suggests this man may currently be living somewhere in this region. Given the environmental work I'm investigating and the surname Clay, I thought perhaps someone local might recognize him." Lena's mind raced through possible responses. Deny recognition completely. Claim the photo was too old to be helpful. Ask about the specific story he was investigating. Each option carried risks she couldn't fully calculate. "I'm afraid I don't recognize him," she said finally, which was technically true. The man in the photograph bore little resemblance to the weathered rancher she knew. "But you might try asking at some of the other local businesses. People around here tend to know each other pretty well." "Actually," Vaughan said, his eyes sharpening with interest, "I've been asking around, and several people mentioned that you do cleaning work for various properties in the area, including some of the more isolated ranches where someone might go if they wanted privacy." The way he said it made Lena realize this wasn't a casual encounter. Vaughan had been researching her specifically, tracking her movements and connections throughout the valley. The business card she held suddenly felt like evidence of her own exposure. "I clean houses, yes," she said carefully, "but I respect my clients' privacy. I wouldn't share information about them even if I had any to share." "Of course," Vaughan replied smoothly. "Professional discretion is admirable. But perhaps you could help me understand something else. I've been reviewing some interesting financial patterns: large-scale conservation land purchases, anonymous donations to environmental groups, strategic funding of rural assistance programs. All of it coordinated in ways that suggest a single source with substantial resources and sophisticated planning." Lena's heart was pounding now, but she forced herself to maintain the confused expression of someone who didn't understand financial complexities. "I'm sorry, I don't really follow that kind of thing. I just clean houses." "Right," Vaughan said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe her. "Well, if you happen to remember anything that might be helpful, I'm staying here at the lodge for the next few days." He handed her another card with his room number written on it, and there would be compensation for information that leads to a good story. Sometimes people who work in service industries have insights that others miss. After Vaughan left, Lena found herself shaking with a combination of fear and anger. She'd been identified, investigated, and approached as a potential source of information about Weston's secret work. The careful boundaries they'd established had been breached by someone with resources and determination to uncover the truth. She waited until her shift ended, then drove to the ranch with Marcus Vaughn's business card burning like evidence in her pocket. She found Weston in the barn, working with the horses in the peaceful rhythm that had become one of her favorite aspects of his character. The sight of him, completely unaware of the threat that had just materialized, made her chest tight with protective instinct. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. 20 minutes later, they sat in the underground complex while Weston reviewed Vaughn's credentials on his secure computer system. The reporter's background was impressive and troubling. Multiple, award-winning investigations into corporate malfeasance, a reputation for persistence and financial backing from publications that could afford long-term investigative projects. "How did he connect you to me?" Weston asked, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "I think he's been monitoring cleaning services throughout the region," Lena replied, "looking for someone who might have access to isolated properties where a wealthy philanthropist could hide. Once he identified me as someone who works multiple ranches, I became a person of interest." Weston pulled up what appeared to be a sophisticated monitoring system, its screens showing data streams that Lena didn't recognize. "He's not working alone," he said after studying the information. "The facial recognition technology he mentioned, the financial pattern analysis that requires resources beyond a typical newspaper budget." "What does that mean?" "It means someone with significant money wants me found, someone who's willing to pay for the kind of investigation that newspapers usually can't afford." Weston's expression was grim. "The question is whether they want me found for legitimate journalistic purposes or for something else entirely." Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground complex's temperature. "The threats you faced before, could they be starting again?" "It's possible. Or it could be competitors trying to identify conservation land we're planning to purchase, or government agencies that want to understand anonymous donation patterns, or simply a reporter who stumbled onto a genuinely interesting story." "What do we do?" Weston stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through multiple scenarios and their implications. "First, we assume the worst-case scenario, that Vaughn has enough information to connect you to me and me to the Foundation work. Second, we implement the emergency protocols I hoped we'd never need, which are, you disappear from his radar immediately. No more work at the lodge while he's in town. No more visits to the ranch that could be observed or documented. We activate the legal protections that make the Foundation's work invisible, even under intense scrutiny. And we prepare for the possibility that I might need to disappear again, more completely this time." The implications hit Lena like a physical blow. "You're talking about ending everything. The Foundation work, our partnership, our relationship, all of it." "I'm talking about protecting it," Weston corrected. "If Vaughn publishes a story that connects Weston Clay to current environmental work, every criminal organization that ever targeted me will know exactly where to find me, and they'll know that anyone close to me is a potential leverage point, so I become a liability. You become a target." Weston stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression intense. "That's not a risk I'm willing to take." Lena stood as well, anger beginning to overcome fear. "That's not your decision to make alone. I knew the risks when I agreed to this partnership. I knew there might be danger." "You knew about theoretical danger," Weston said firmly. "You didn't know about investigators with facial recognition technology and unlimited budgets. You didn't know about the specific ways that visibility kills people in this world. So what are you saying? That we run? That we abandon all the work we've been building?" Weston moved to one of the filing cabinets and withdrew what appeared to be a pre-prepared emergency folder. "I'm saying we have 48 hours to decide. Either we find a way to neutralize this threat completely, or we activate protocols that will separate us for both of our safety." The folder contained documents that took Lena's breath away. New identities, financial arrangements, relocation plans that would scatter them to different continents if necessary. It was clear evidence that Weston had never truly believed their carefully balanced life could last indefinitely. "You've been planning to leave all along," she said, the words carrying more hurt than she'd intended. "I've been planning for the possibility that I might have to leave," Weston corrected. "That's not the same thing. But yes, I've always known this might not be permanent." Lena looked around the underground complex that had become a second home to her, at the maps and documents representing work that mattered more than anything she'd ever been part of. The thought of losing it all, the conservation projects, the community assistance programs, the partnership with Weston himself, felt like losing her entire future. "There has to be another way," she said. "Maybe," Weston replied, "but we have less than 2 days to find it." As they climbed back toward ground level, Lena carried with her the devastating realization that their carefully constructed world had always been more fragile than she'd understood. The foundation work that had given her life purpose, the relationship that had given her hope, the future they'd been building together, all of it could disappear in a matter of hours if they couldn't solve a problem that might already be beyond their control. The Montana wilderness looked different now, less like protected sanctuary and more like a hiding place that had been discovered by forces neither of them could fully predict or control. For the first time since she'd learned Weston's secret, Lena understood why he'd chosen isolation over love, safety over connection, careful invisibility over the risk of genuine partnership. But understanding his choice didn't make it any easier. To accept that their time together might already be ending before it had truly begun. The next morning brought news that transformed their 48-hour deadline into something far more urgent. Harold Pitt called Lena before dawn, his voice tight with concern that immediately set her on edge. "You need to know what's happening at the lodge," he said without preamble. "That report of Vaughn, he's not just asking casual questions anymore. He's got a whole setup in the conference room, multiple laptops, some kind of scanning equipment, and he's been making calls to what sound like law enforcement agencies." Lena felt her stomach drop. "What kind of calls?" "I only caught pieces, but he was talking about financial tracking, database searches, something about coordinating with federal investigators." "Lena, I think this is bigger than just a newspaper story." After hanging up, Lena drove to the ranch with speed that probably compromised the careful anonymity they'd been trying to maintain. She found Weston in the underground complex, surrounded by communication equipment and looking like a man preparing for war. "It's not just journalism," she said the moment she reached the bottom of the stairs. "I know," Weston replied, his voice grim. "I've been monitoring communications traffic since yesterday evening. Vaughn is coordinating with at least 3 different federal agencies, FBI, IRS, and something that might be Treasury Department Financial Crimes Division. What does that mean?" Weston turned to face her, and Lena saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not just concern, but genuine fear. "It means they're not trying to write a story about anonymous philanthropy. They're building a case for criminal investigation." "Criminal investigation of what?" "Money laundering, tax evasion, violation of foreign asset reporting requirements. Any number of technical violations that can result from operating a complex philanthropic structure without complete government transparency." Weston gestured at the wall of monitors showing encrypted data streams. "The Foundation's work is completely legal, but the methods we use to maintain anonymity can look suspicious to investigators who don't understand the security requirements." Lena sank into a chair, the implications hitting her like a physical weight. "They think you're a criminal. They think I'm someone worth investigating as a potential criminal, which from a law enforcement perspective amounts to the same thing, until they prove otherwise. How long do we have?" "Based on the communication patterns I'm seeing, they're planning some kind of coordinated action within the next 24 hours. Possibly searches, definitely interviews, probably asset freezing. Pending investigation. Lena looked around the underground complex that had become so familiar, trying to imagine federal agents descending on this carefully constructed sanctuary. The emergency protocols. Are we activating them? Weston was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on something she couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that felt final. There's something I haven't told you. Something about the emergency protocols that changes everything. He moved to a section of the wall she'd never paid attention to before, an area that looked like simple stone facing. His fingers found hidden controls, and a panel slid away to reveal what appeared to be a sophisticated safe. The foundations. Real assets, he said, withdrawing documents and what looked like multiple sets of identification papers. Not the legal structures that investigators can trace, but the actual resources that fund everything we do. He handed her a folder whose contents took her breath away. Bearer bonds, precious metal certificates, cryptocurrency wallet codes, and what appeared to be ownership documents for properties and businesses across multiple countries. The dollar values represented were staggering. Not the 800 million they'd discussed, but numbers that approached several $billion. The Clearwater Conservation Trust is just the visible portion, Weston explained, the tip of an iceberg that my family has been building for 4 generations. Most of our real assets exist in forms that can't be easily traced or seized by any single government. You've been lying to me about the scope of this. I've been protecting you from knowledge that would make you an even more valuable target than you already are. The people who want to find me aren't just interested in hundreds of millions. They're interested in resources that could fund small countries. Lena felt the foundation of everything she'd believed about their situation shifting beneath her. How much are we really talking about? Total family assets, including resources held by my father and grandfather before they died. Probably somewhere north of $4 billion, held in structures so complex that no single government agency could unravel them completely. The numbers were beyond her ability to comprehend. She'd been thinking about their situation as a matter of a wealthy philanthropist trying to maintain privacy. The reality was something else entirely. A financial empire that operated on a scale that made governments nervous. The emergency protocols, she said slowly, they're not just about you disappearing. They're about dismantling something that affects global conservation funding. Yes, if I activate the full protocols, not only do I disappear permanently, but the foundation work ends completely. The conservation projects stop, the community assistance programs shut down, and billions of dollars in protected land potentially becomes vulnerable to development. Weston moved to another hidden panel, revealing communication equipment more sophisticated than anything she'd seen before. But there's an alternative, something I've been considering since yesterday evening, which is, we don't run, we don't hide. We go public voluntarily, on our own terms, before the investigators can build their case. The suggestion was so contrary to everything he'd told her about security, about the dangers of visibility, that Lena wondered if the stress had affected his judgment. Go public, after everything you've said about what happened to Margaret, about the threats that forced you into hiding. The threats were different 15 years ago, Weston said. They were about personal wealth that could be targeted through kidnapping and extortion. This situation is about institutional investigation that thrives on secrecy and speculation. Sometimes the best defense against institutional pressure is radical transparency. He activated one of the communication systems, and suddenly, the underground complex was connected to what appeared to be a conference call with multiple participants. Ladies and gentlemen, Weston said to the hidden speakers, I'm activating Protocol 7. A woman's voice responded immediately, crisp and professional. Understood. Legal teams are standing by in Washington, New York, and San Francisco. Media. Coordination is ready for implementation. Do you want to proceed with full disclosure or limited transparency? Full disclosure, Weston said. Everything. The family history, the conservation work, the financial structures, the security concerns that necessitated anonymity, complete transparency about methods and motivations. That's a significant risk, another voice warned. Once the information is public, there's no returning to anonymous operations. I understand, Weston replied, but the alternative is allowing investigators to control the narrative, to frame legal philanthropic work as potential criminal activity. We go public with the truth before they can go public with their suspicions. Lena listened to the conversation with growing amazement. How long have you been planning this option? Since the day I decided to trust you with the secret, Weston admitted. Protocol 7 was designed around the possibility that the foundation work could continue with a partner, someone who could help manage the public scrutiny while maintaining the conservation focus. You're talking about me. I'm talking about us. If we do this, if we go public voluntarily, we do it together. The Clearwater Conservation Trust becomes a transparent organization with visible leadership. We lose the ability to operate anonymously, but we gain legal protection and the possibility of expanding our work on a scale that secrecy never allowed. The communication system crackled with activity as the legal teams began coordinating what sounded like a massive, multi-state disclosure process. Lena realized she was witnessing the preparation for one of the largest voluntary financial disclosures in philanthropic history. What about the danger? She asked. The security concerns that drove you into hiding? They become manageable rather than overwhelming, Weston said. Visible wealth with transparent purposes is much harder to exploit criminally than hidden wealth with mysterious sources. And we'd have resources for legitimate security that wouldn't compromise the work itself. Lena looked around the underground complex one more time, understanding that whatever they decided in the next few hours would determine not just their future together, but the future of conservation work that spanned continents. The choice was no longer between safety and exposure. It was between managed transparency and forced investigation, between controlling their story and having their story controlled by others. If we do this, she said slowly, if we go public together, what happens to us, to the relationship we've been building? Weston turned off the communication system and moved to stand directly in front of her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. That depends on whether you're willing to be my partner, not just in secret but in public. Whether you're prepared to help me manage transparency instead of anonymity, visibility instead of hiddenness. You're asking me to be the public face of a multi-billion-dollar foundation. I'm asking you to be my partner in the most important work either of us will ever do. Everything else, the money, the publicity, the complexity, is just context. Lena felt the weight of the decision settling over her like a mantle. In less than 24 hours, she could go from being a hotel cleaner carrying someone else's secret to being a co-director of one of the world's most significant conservation organizations. The transformation was almost too large to comprehend, but as she looked at Weston, seeing not just the wealthy philanthropist or the careful protector of secrets, but the man who'd trusted her with everything he cared about, she realized the choice had already been made. Somewhere in the weeks of working together, of sharing burdens and building something meaningful, she'd stopped being able to imagine a future that didn't include him and the work they could do together. How long do we have to decide? She asked. The legal teams need an answer in 6 hours, Weston replied. If we're going to control this disclosure, we need to move before the investigators do. 6 hours to choose between the careful invisibility that had protected them and the radical transparency that could transform their work from a secret operation into a global force for conservation. 6 hours to decide whether their partnership could survive the transition from hidden to visible, from protected to exposed. Outside the underground complex, dawn was breaking over the Montana wilderness they'd worked so hard to preserve. Soon, That same landscape might bear their names, their faces, their public commitment to ensuring its protection for generations to come. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, a glimpse of a future that would require courage neither of them had ever been forced to display. But as Lena looked at the communication equipment still humming with preparation for their potential disclosure, she realized that courage was exactly what their situation demanded. The question was whether they possessed enough of it to step into the light together, trusting that their partnership was strong enough to survive the scrutiny that visibility would bring. 4 hours into their 6-hour deadline, Lena found herself standing in Pine Ridge Lodge's main conference room, staring at the elaborate setup Marcus Vaughn had assembled for what was clearly much more than a newspaper investigation. Multiple laptops displayed financial tracking software, while sophisticated recording equipment suggested preparation for formal interviews that would carry legal weight. She'd made her choice about Protocol 7, but implementing it required one final piece of intelligence, understanding exactly what Vaughn and his federal partners thought they'd discovered and how close they were to taking action that would force Weston into permanent hiding. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, approaching his workstation with the careful deference of someone seeking employment rather than information. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about compensation for helpful information." Vaughn looked up from his screens, his expression immediately sharpening with interest. "Ah, Lena, I was hoping you'd reconsider. Please sit down." What followed was the most dangerous conversation of Lena's life, a careful dance of revealing just enough to seem cooperative while gathering the intelligence they needed to make Protocol 7 work. Vaughn's questions were precise and legally crafted, clearly designed to build a case rather than simply gather information. "The thing is," Lena said, playing the role of someone motivated by financial need rather than loyalty, "I do clean for someone who might be the person you're looking for, but he's been good to me, you know? Fair wages, respectful treatment. I'd need to know this isn't going to hurt him unfairly." "What we're investigating isn't personal," Vaughn assured her, though. His tone suggested the opposite. "It's about compliance with federal financial regulations. Anonymous charitable giving is legal, but there are reporting requirements, transparency obligations. We just need to understand whether those have been met." Lena nodded as if this explanation satisfied her concerns, while mentally cataloguing the specific language Vaughn was using: financial regulations, reporting requirements, transparency obligations, the kind of technical violations that could be prosecuted even when the underlying work was completely legitimate. "The ranch where I work," she said carefully, "it's pretty isolated. The owner keeps to himself, doesn't socialize much in town, but he seems to have money for improvements, good equipment, that kind of thing. Does he receive a lot of mail? Phone calls? Visitors who might be conducting business?" "Some mail, but it's usually delivered to a post office box in town rather than the ranch directly. I've never seen business visitors, but then I'm usually focused on my cleaning work." Vaughn made careful notes, and Lena could see him building a profile that would support search warrants, asset seizures, the kind of legal action that would destroy everything Weston had worked to build. "There's something else," she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I heard him on the phone once talking about some kind of meeting. Today, actually. Something about making announcements, coordinating with legal teams. This was the crucial information, the suggestion that Weston was planning something that would happen before any federal action could be taken." Vaughn's reaction was immediate and telling. "Today? What kind of meeting?" "I don't know exactly, but it sounded important. Something about timing being critical, about getting ahead of some kind of schedule." Vaughn was already reaching for his phone, clearly planning to accelerate whatever coordination he'd established with federal agencies. "Lena, this is very helpful information. We may need to move our timeline up significantly." "Move it up to when?" "This afternoon, possibly within the next few hours." Lena felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with terror. She'd gotten the intelligence they needed, confirmation that federal action was imminent, but she'd also potentially triggered immediate danger for Weston. "About the compensation," she said, maintaining her role even as her mind raced through. "Implications. How much were you thinking? For information this valuable, $10,000, paid immediately upon verification." The amount was staggering for someone in Lena's supposed financial position, and it confirmed that Vaughn's investigation had backing far beyond typical journalism budgets. Someone with significant resources wanted Weston found and was willing to pay handsomely for information that led to his exposure. "I'll need to think about it," Lena said. "$10,000 is a lot of money, but I don't want to betray someone who's been decent to me." "Of course," Vaughn replied, "but I should mention, if we proceed with our investigation based on other sources, and you're later discovered to have withheld relevant information, that could be problematic for you legally." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Lena was being positioned as either a cooperating witness or a potential target of investigation herself. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "Given the timeline we're now working with, I'd need an answer within the next 2 hours." Lena left the conference room with her cover story intact and her mission accomplished, but also with the devastating knowledge that their 6-hour deadline had just become a 2-hour emergency. Vaughn and his federal partners were planning action for this afternoon, triggered by her suggestion that Weston was preparing something that required immediate intervention. She drove to the ranch with carefully controlled speed, knowing that any deviation from normal behavior could now be observed and interpreted as suspicious. But inside, she felt the urgency of countdown to crisis that could destroy everything they'd worked to build. She found Weston exactly where she'd left him, surrounded by communication equipment and legal documents that would soon be either their salvation or their destruction. The moment he saw her expression, she knew he understood that their situation had changed dramatically. "How long do we have?" he asked. 2 hours, maybe less," Lena replied. "They're moving this afternoon, and they're offering $10,000 for information that confirms your location." Weston's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands still on the documents he'd been reviewing. "Then we're past the point of choice. Protocol 7 is no longer an option, it's a necessity." He activated the communication system with quick, practiced movements. "All teams, this is Control. We are implementing Protocol 7 immediately. I repeat, immediately. All disclosure protocols are now active." The response was instantaneous, a flurry of professional voices confirming legal filings, media coordination, and what sounded like simultaneous disclosure events across multiple time zones. Legal teams are filing transparency documents with Treasury, IRS, and FBI field offices in 12 locations, one voice reported. Media coordination is releasing prepared statements to major environmental publications and financial news services. Full disclosure will be public within 90 minutes. 90 minutes, Weston said to Lena. "That's how long we have to get. Move to the town hall and make our own announcement before the legal filings become public and this story gets told by other people." Lena felt the weight of transformation settling over her like an avalanche. In 90 minutes, her life as an anonymous hotel cleaner would end forever. In 90 minutes, she would become the public partner of one of the world's most significant conservation philanthropists. In 90 minutes, everything would change. "The town hall meeting," she said, understanding suddenly. "That's where we make our stand. That's where we take control of our story," Weston confirmed, "where we announce the Clearwater conservation. Trust's transition from anonymous operations to full transparency, and where we ask our community to help us manage the changes that visibility will bring." He handed her a folder containing what appeared to be prepared remarks, legal talking points, and contact information for the media teams that were already coordinating their disclosure. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. Lena looked around the underground complex one final time, understanding that this might be the last moment of privacy they would ever share. From this point forward, their relationship, their work, their entire lives would be subject to public scrutiny and professional management. But as she met Weston's eyes, seeing the trust and partnership that had grown between them despite all the complications, she realized that she'd never been more ready for anything in her life. "Let's go," she said. "Let's tell our story before anyone else gets the chance." The town hall was already filling when Lena and Weston arrived, though they'd given no advance notice of their intention to speak. Word had spread through the valley's informal communication networks, the kind of gossip chain that made privacy nearly impossible in small communities, but also created the social bonds that held such places together. Lena recognized faces throughout the crowd. Tom Morrison, whose ranch had been saved by anonymous assistants. The elementary school principal, whose science program had been mysteriously funded. Families from the food bank, the hospital auxiliary, the conservation group that maintained hiking trails through protected wilderness. Without knowing it, nearly everyone in the room had been touched by Weston's work. Mayor Patricia Santos called the meeting to order with the businesslike efficiency of someone who'd managed municipal affairs for 15 years. She was Maria's older sister, and Lena could see the family resemblance in her direct gaze and no-nonsense bearing. "We have 2 items on tonight's agenda," Mayor Santos announced. "First, a discussion about the environmental impact study for the proposed mining exploration near Copper Creek. Second, an update on the school district's budget situation." Weston stood before either agenda item could be addressed. "Mayor Santos, I'd like to request permission to address the community on a matter of urgent importance." The murmur that ran through the crowd reflected both curiosity and concern. Weston Clay was known to most residents, but he'd never participated in town meetings, never drawn attention to himself in any public forum. "Of course, Mr. Clay, Mayor," Santos replied. "Please come forward." As Weston walked to the front of the room, Lena felt her heart pounding with a combination of pride and terror. In the next few minutes, everything about their carefully constructed life would be exposed to public scrutiny. The man she'd come to love was about to reveal secrets that could transform not just their relationship, but the entire economic and environmental future of their region. "My name is Weston Clay," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room without amplification. "For the past 15 years, I've been your neighbor, living quietly on a ranch up Copper Creek Road. Most of you know me as someone who keeps to himself, who doesn't socialize much, who seems to live simply." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "What you don't know is that I've also been your anonymous benefactor. The elementary school's science program, the Morrison Ranch's debt restructuring, the food bank's expansion, the conservation land purchases that have protected over 40,000 acres in this valley, all of it has been funded through a foundation that I've operated in secret for more than a decade." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of people breathing and the distant hum of the building's heating system. Lena could see shock, disbelief, and gradual understanding moving across faces throughout the room. Tom Morrison stood slowly, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "Mr. Clay, are you saying you're the one who saved our ranch?" "I'm saying that the Clearwater Conservation Trust, which I've managed anonymously, provided the financial restructuring that allowed you to keep your land, along with similar assistance to dozens of other families and organizations throughout the region." "Why?" The question came from Sarah Miller, who had returned to the valley after her house was rebuilt. "Why help people anonymously? Why not take credit for the good you were doing?" Weston's expression grew somber, and Lena saw him drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known he possessed. "Because 15 years ago, my wife was murdered by criminals who targeted her because of my visible wealth and philanthropy. I came to Montana to disappear, to continue helping people without the publicity that makes generosity dangerous. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the crowd. This was no longer just about anonymous charity. It was about tragedy, survival, and the kind of sacrifice that transformed simple kindness into something approaching heroism. The reason I'm telling you this now, Weston continued, is because that anonymity is about to end. Federal investigators are preparing to expose my work through legal action that could destroy the foundation and end the conservation efforts that have protected this valley. I'm choosing to tell you the truth myself rather than let others control that story. Mayor Santos leaned forward, her expression serious. What kind of legal action? Investigation for potential money laundering, tax evasion, and violation of federal financial reporting requirements. The investigators believe that anonymous philanthropy at this scale must involve criminal activity. They're wrong, but proving that could take years and cost millions in legal fees while the conservation work stops entirely. Lena stood, knowing that this was the moment for her own transformation from observer to participant. "I'm Lena Maris," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Most of you know me as someone who cleans hotel rooms and does odd jobs around the valley. What you don't know is that I've been working with Mr. Clay to coordinate the Foundation's local assistance programs." She could see surprise and curiosity in the faces turned toward her, but also recognition and respect. These were people who'd known her family for generations, who understood her character and work ethic. "The choice we're facing," she continued, "is between ending the Foundation's work to avoid investigation or transitioning to complete transparency that will allow the conservation and assistance programs to continue under public scrutiny." "What does transparency mean?" asked Dr. Jennifer Webb, who ran the regional medical clinic. "How would it change things?" Weston stepped forward again. "It means the Clearwater Conservation Trust becomes a public organization with visible leadership and open financial records. It means the conservation work continues and expands, but under media attention and public oversight. And it means that anyone connected to the Foundation, including everyone in this room who has benefited from its programs, becomes part of a story that will attract national attention." The implications were staggering. Their small community, which had treasured its privacy and independence, would suddenly find itself at the center of one of the largest philanthropic disclosure stories in recent history. "There's something else you need to know," Lena added, her voice carrying the weight of the decision they'd made together. "If we move forward with transparency, Mr. Clay and I will be asking this community to help us manage the Foundation's transition, not just as beneficiaries of assistance, but as partners in conservation work that could affect millions of acres across the American West." Tom Morrison stood again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions. "Mr. Clay, Miss Maris, I think I speak for a lot of people here when I say we're grateful for everything the Foundation has done. But what we really want to know is simple. Will this transparency help or hurt the work that's been protecting our land and supporting our families?" Weston's answer was immediate and certain. "It will help. The resources are vast enough to fund conservation work at a scale that anonymity never allowed. But it will require courage from all of us, courage to step into visibility, to defend work that matters, and to prove that philanthropy can operate with complete transparency while remaining effective." As Lena looked around the room, she saw the faces of people making the same kind of choice she and Weston had made, choosing the difficult path that led towards something better rather than the easy path that preserved existing comfort. The foundation of their future was being built in this moment, not just by her and Weston's decision to embrace transparency, but by their community's willingness to support work that was larger than any individual's comfort or privacy. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under starlight, protected and preserved through careful work that would now continue under the scrutiny of a watching world. It was beautiful and purposeful and worth the risk they were all taking together. 6 months later, Lena stood on the front porch of what had once been Weston's secret ranch, watching the morning sun rise over a landscape that now bore their names on conservation easements, environmental education centers, and the headquarters of the Clearwater Conservation Trust. The transformation had been more dramatic than either of them had anticipated, but also more successful than they dared to hope. The underground complex had been converted into a visitor center where school groups and conservation organizations could learn about sustainable land management. The barn that had once hidden Weston's secret now housed offices for the Trust's staff of environmental scientists, legal experts, and community liaison. What had begun as a one-man operation conducted in isolation had become a collaborative effort involving dozens of professionals and hundreds of community volunteers. The morning's agenda included a video conference with the Trust's new branch, offices in Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado, an expansion that had become possible only through the transparency that had initially terrified them both. Federal investigators, rather than finding evidence of criminal activity, had discovered one of the most effective and legally compliant philanthropic operations they'd ever examined. The investigation had ended with commendations rather than charges, and with requests for the Trust to serve as a model for other conservation organizations. Weston emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of contentment that had gradually replaced the careful vigilance she remembered from their early days together. The transition to transparency hadn't been easy for him. Years of protective secrecy couldn't be abandoned overnight, but he'd adapted with the same strategic intelligence that had made his anonymous work so effective. The school group arrives. "At 10, he said, settling beside her on the porch swing they'd installed to replace the solitary chair where he'd once sat alone. 37 fourth graders from Billings, plus teachers and parent volunteers. Dr. Martinez says they're particularly excited about the wildlife cameras we installed along Copper Creek." Lena smiled, thinking about the children who would spend the day learning about conservation in a place that had once been completely hidden from the world. The educational programs had become one of the Trust's most successful initiatives, inspiring a new generation of environmental stewards while building community support for their expanded work. "Any word from the Foundation Board about the Montana Wilderness Protection Act?" she asked. "Senator Williams thinks we have the votes for passage, thanks to the economic impact study we funded. Turns out that transparent philanthropy carries a lot more political weight than anonymous donations." The legislative victory they were anticipating would protect over 2 million acres of wilderness across the state, an achievement that dwarfed anything Weston had accomplished during his years of secret operation. Transparency had indeed unlocked possibilities that anonymity had never allowed. Lena's phone buzzed with a text from her brother Danny, now in his senior year at Montana State, with a full scholarship from the Trust's Rural Education Initiative. His message included a photo from his internship at Yellowstone National Park, where he was studying wildlife biology and preparing for graduate school with the kind of confidence that came from knowing his education was fully funded. Her grandmother, Lena, sat in the garden behind the Trust's regional office in town, where she'd moved after the Foundation's healthcare assistance program had provided comprehensive medical care that had significantly improved her condition. The industrial poisoning case remained in legal limbo, but Elena's daily reality had transformed from struggle to comfort, from worry to security. The afternoon brought their weekly coordination meeting with other conservation organizations, a gathering that took place in the conference room that had once been Weston's secret command center. Representatives from the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and the Sierra Club now collaborated regularly with the Trust on projects spanning multiple states and involving hundreds of millions of dollars in conservation funding. The Pacific Northwest Timber Protection Initiative is ahead of schedule, reported Dr. Sarah Chen, the Trust's new Director of Land Acquisition. We've secured conservation easements on 87% of the targeted properties, with completion expected by year-end. The carbon offset program is generating more revenue than projected, added Michael Torres, their financial director. The surplus could fund an additional 10,000 acres of protection in the Rockies region. Lena found herself marveling at the scale of what they'd built together. The fear and uncertainty of those final secret months had given way to an operation that affected environmental policy across the American West, influenced federal legislation, and served as a model for conservation organizations worldwide. But it was the personal transformation that felt most significant. She and Weston had begun as employer and employee, evolved into secret partners, and emerged as public collaborators in work that neither could have accomplished alone. The relationship that had developed in hiding had not only survived exposure, but had deepened through the shared challenge of building something larger than either of their individual capabilities. That evening, they walked through the meadow, where Weston had once grazed a small herd of cattle as part of his rancher disguise. The land now served as a demonstration site for sustainable grazing practices, with research plots that provided data for conservation efforts across the region. The transformation from deception to education, from hiding to teaching, felt symbolic of everything their partnership had become. "Do you ever miss it?" Lena asked as they paused beside the creek that had given the trust its name. "The simplicity of the anonymous work, the privacy we used to have?" Weston considered the question carefully, watching the water flow past rocks that had been carved by centuries of patient erosion. "I miss the safety of invisibility sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't miss the isolation, and I definitely don't miss the limitations that secrecy imposed on what we could accomplish." He gestured toward the valley that stretched before them, now protected in perpetuity through conservation easements that bore both their names. "This work touches hundreds of thousands of acres now, affects legislation that will influence environmental policy for generations. We couldn't have achieved that scale while hiding from the world." "And personally," Lena asked, "do you miss being able to disappear, to avoid the kind of connection that made you vulnerable?" Weston turned to face her, his expression carrying the warmth and openness that had gradually replaced the careful guardedness she remembered from their early encounters. "Never," he said with certainty. "I spent 15 years believing that safety required isolation, that effectiveness required anonymity. You taught me that the most important work can only be done in partnership, with trust and transparency and the willingness to be vulnerable for something larger than personal security." As they walked back toward the house, Lena carried with her a sense of completion that felt both satisfying and forward-looking. The transformation from secret partnership to public collaboration had required courage from both of them, but it had also revealed possibilities neither had imagined during those careful months of hidden work. The foundation charter they'd signed that morning committed them to another decade of conservation work together, with expanded programs that would protect millions of additional acres while providing environmental education to thousands of students annually. It was ambitious enough to require everything they'd learned about partnership, strategy, and the careful balance between individual needs and collective goals. But more than that, it represented a future built on the understanding that some secrets were worth keeping and others were worth sharing, that some risks were worth avoiding and others were worth embracing, and that the most meaningful work often required the courage to step into visibility with someone trustworthy, enough to share both the burden and the joy of making a difference. The Montana wilderness that surrounded them would remain protected long after they were gone, preserved through work that had begun in secret and matured into transparency. It was a legacy worth the transformation they'd undergone together, worth the risks they'd taken, worth the choice to build something lasting with someone who understood that true wealth lay not in what could be hidden, but in what could be shared. With a world that needed the kind of careful stewardship only partnership could provide.